It's time to hit some news and notes. Partha, are you ready?
I'm ready. I've got the new mic ready to go.
Let's get it. So we actually delayed recording this show, hoping that by the time we recorded, we would have an election result. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the nation is complying with us, so we can't really tell you discuss who the next president is. But we definitely can get into a thorough discussion about the election itself, which I think is actually more fascinating as we've talked about it than the actual result is going to be anyways. So
Yeah, that's how I feel, man. It's just last night I was watching the election. I was just like, man, this is like sports, you know?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
exciting. It's exciting to see who wins what and what strategies they used.
yeah. I mean, this is a very, very compelling election. And I think as I was thinking about it and I was seeing the results, the thing that stood out to me first and foremost is that how much, not the virus itself, but how much coronavirus is playing a role in this election,
Oh
right?
yeah.
I mean, without early voting specifically, I don't know if we don't have a guaranteed Trump win this time around. If you look at it and look at how the split is between the early voting and the mail-in ballots versus day of voting,
Yeah.
I mean, it's very clear that that's made a huge difference. So, people who are anxious to get Trump out of office and have been depressed by this coronavirus, it's very ironic that it may be the reason that he doesn't get 4 more years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And just the component of, which states are counting them when has played an interesting caveat. First of all, kind of ridiculous to not count your mail in votes
Yeah,
before the actual election has happened. I don't know what the reason would be for that, but states like Pennsylvania have chosen to do that. And so that means there's a possibility we won't even know till Friday who's
yeah.
president.
That's so unfortunate. And what's sad about this is kind of the black eye of the electorate always goes to Florida, right? Since the whole
Yeah.
whole Al Gore debacle. And it seems like they're the one state that got that of the larger states got it right. They've counted everything, like,
Yeah.
right? So it just, I agree with you. It makes no sense at all, especially in an election like this. You can keep those results locked away, but there's absolutely no reason not to have those counted and ready to go
Yeah.
before election night, because the fact that
Absolutely.
we're going to have to wait until Friday to get a result is just is ludicrous.
Yeah. And I've got a little election simulator in front of me that I've been playing with. Just to kind of go through the case studies, but just to talk about the states that are still in question, you've got Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. And right now, Michigan and Wisconsin and Nevada are all leaning blue, and Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia are all leaning red. And man, I mean, let me just click through that, but I'm not sure who that favors. Oh, I guess Maine second district isn't decided. Do you know about these second district races?
I
These like
don't. I
random.
know they mentioned. I read about it for the first time yesterday. How Nebraska split and Maine split, right? And they're actually saying that the one electoral vote from the split in Maine could very well determine this election.
Wow.
I don't fully understand it, but
So as the map sits right now, I just went through the simulator. If everyone who has the current lead, this is Wednesday morning that we're recording this, so there's still votes being counted,
yep,
but the current situation is looking to play out in Biden's favor. If he wins Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Maine, that I guess Maine doesn't really matter here because I just flipped it to Trump and it didn't do anything for the outcome. But he
yep,
has to win basically the Rust Belt and his um, he has to get Nevada. That's an interesting one because that's one that's typically kind of been I guess, a pretty important swing state.
yeah. We're seeing. This is going to be this is a very unique election in terms of how things are playing out. If you were to tell me Trump is going to win Ohio, Florida, and Pennsylvania, and I had X amount of dollars in my bank account, I would have put it all on the line that he was going to win the election. right?
Yeah.
That's how these elections play out. The fact for the very first time in history, we're potentially going to see a candidate lose despite winning those three big swing states is history in itself. And then, like you said, some of these West Coast traditionally red states like Nevada and Arizona flipping over to Biden is very unique, obviously. And it
Yeah.
also, I don't know what that says, but I will say that it probably showcases that each state right now is facing unique challenges, and the electorate within those states are probably voting on those things. One thing we talked about before the show started was perhaps it has to do with how much the economy in Nevada is struggling right now with the lack of tourism from going to Vegas, going to Reno. Um, I don't know if that's it, but it's a big swing to take Nevada
Yeah.
over to blue.
It's an interesting one because Vegas was one of those cities that during the pandemic just refused to shut down. If you remember, people were
Yeah,
still going, and you could still go. You could still go do a
yeah,
lot of stuff. That's interesting to me that a state that would have those policies would lean blue, which would indicate that many people who live there that may not be, voting in the local elections probably use their voice in this one.
yeah. I think overall, when you look at how elections work and how people vote on, it's a very personal decision, right? And I think if you look at Nevada right now, a large population of the electorate that works in these jobs, forget the from a policy standpoint, they're struggling right now, right? A lot of them have been laid off, struggling financially. There hasn't been a second relief bill. So perhaps that's what's driving a lot of people to say, you know what, we need change because right now what's happening isn't benefiting us in any way. That's a guess.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
preaching
I
that. I
mean,
know,
It it's very possible. I think one of the things that's a bit disappointing looking at the electoral map is how regionally polarized these states are. Just to see the entirety of, what I mean, what we would consider like typically red states and all of these swing states that you mentioned to go completely red, and then to see mostly coastal states, along with a good chunk of the Midwest, but more of the manufacturing portion of the Midwest go blue is a really, really interesting indicator in the divisiveness in the country. And what's even more interesting is that a lot of these cities that have gone blue, like, Detroit, like Chicago, um, while they are urban centers that typically lean liberal, these are also the areas that really Trump had focused on when he was campaigning in terms
yeah,
of bringing back manufacturing, auto manufacturing, all these different industries that have affected these states. And yeah, that's a surprise to me. It's incongruent with the rest of the data that I see. So I'm just not sure what to make out of the way that we split. But I think one of the things that I've been observing that has been interesting is just the reactions of people to the election. And
yeah,
I think one thing that is interesting is I've noticed a lot of my friends, liberal or conservative, kind of take one of two approaches. One, which I prefer, is the "Hey, we're all American. It's an election, and now
yeah,
we move forward." Um, the other, which is interesting, is if we win, hey, we're all American. Literally, I saw this post on somebody's feed. If we win, we're all American. If we lose, we're gonna keep fighting.
yeah,
And it's like, well, I don't think we need to fight each other. I just don't. I think we can
yeah,
debate. I think we can have conversation, but uh, I'm more of a like a unity guy. I don't really believe in party politics, and I think maybe some of what we're seeing in this election is parties starting to represent identities within the country between the two new, almost like caricatures of America, like the urban liberal and then the rural conservative.
yeah. I mean, one of my larger points of contention with Trump is his instigation of this. I completely understand it from a strategy standpoint. Like, he wants to make it very clear to a large population of the rural population of America who kind of vote on specific things of we're taking our that thought of these people, whoever these people are, it can be a wide group of people, are taking our country over versus it being a hey, we're all American type of position.
Yeah.
It's like he's playing the political game based on the electoral college, which from a strictly strategy standpoint, you completely understand. And in some ways you respect because that's why he won the last election. And that's why, but then the larger issue is there a moral question or a moral dilemma that he should be facing more? I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or is it this is a game that politicians have to play to win, and whatever strategy you take to win, if it works, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And I think part of it is, the moral dilemma exists because we have the information to know that some of what he says is false,
Yeah,
right? So when he positions things a certain way, we can actually just look on social media and see that on the ground things are not so extreme.
yeah,
Same thing, flipped in terms of how we see the country. And I was in a lively debate with somebody the other day who had a very anti-Trump view
yeah.
and said, if you vote for him, then you can't be my friend. And I see the divisiveness on both sides from a party
Oh,
politics standpoint.
that yes, and I think again, and I think you bring up a good
Yeah,
point because the counter for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? And right now, we're in a very emotionally divided country
yeah,
where if your vote signals more to people on one side or the other than just, hey, this is the candidate that I support. It's much deeper. There are race issues, there are socioeconomic issues, there are many things that I think have been boiling under the surface in America for a long time, but now are rising back to the top. Right
yeah,
when you have times of struggle like this, the divisions are gonna show themselves. But the truth is, America's always been a very divided country. We all
yeah,
figure out a way to get along for the pursuit of capitalism, but as from a cultural standpoint, you looked at the map, you see it. Urban centers are mostly liberal, democratic. Once you get outside of those centers, you're looking at a complete opposite mentality in rural populations. And
yeah,
so the question becomes, how do you is it the country's responsibility to figure out how to bridge that gap, or is it the country's responsibility just to create a system in which these very very different groups of people with different mentalities can coexist?
yeah. And I think you've pointed out an interesting nuance that I think deserves kind of more of a breakdown, but it's the difference between what is the responsibility of the system versus what's the responsibility of the people who operate within that system.
Yeah,
And you know, your vote should not be something people take personally. And I think that's a big thing that we see today. We see it on sports opinions all the time. If I say LeBron's the GOAT, I'm going to have 300 people message me and say MJ's the GOAT
yeah,
and get mad at me for saying that. And, me feeling a certain way or expressing a belief or even casting a vote, which by the way is private, um, it doesn't have any bearing on who I am as a person. It has a bearing on what decision I want to make at that time, right?
yeah,
And it's we can't take somebody's vote and attribute values to them without taking the time to get to know them because people are not binary. People are all sorts of types. And I
yep,
think the irony that I see is that it's the people that are the most persecuted. The friend that I was in the debate with yesterday is someone I respect tremendously. He's a huge leader in the LGBTQ community. And for somebody who's so much about, hey, we're persecuted, we need to get more rights, we need to be treated fairly, we need you to understand who we are. I just thought it was extremely hypocritical to say, but I'm not willing to understand who you are for someone who disagrees with me. And I think that's kind of the main thing that's happening in this country right now. And I don't think it's a fault of the system. I think the system has existed, but society is changing as a result of all the means of
yeah,
communication we have. But I think this level of emotional growth is required for the country to understand that when someone expresses opinion, it doesn't mean anything about you. That's you projecting your own insecurities or fears or pain onto what they said and attributing
Yep.
characteristics to them.
Yep. And you know, another thing about it is it's like you can't grow that way. You can't
Yeah.
grow without learning perspectives outside of your own. Even if you don't agree with someone or you think they're batshit crazy. I've learned a lot from people that I think are batshit crazy because understanding how people think and understanding that there are pockets of people who think just like that. So if you
Yeah.
understand someone who thinks like that, it helps you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the larger issues, and I think you're right. It's how society is changing because 10, 15 years ago, when you talked about hot button issues, you talked about it with the same 5 friends, right? That you
Yeah.
interacted with the most, knew and were the most comfortable with sharing all of your opinions with. Now we live in a society where it's encouraged to broadcast your opinions on every subject consistently.
Yeah.
And so from a and it's I'm happy about it because it helps me understand people, but it also from a political standpoint creates the tensions that already existed around politics are now even more hot button because there's so much noise, right? That
Yeah.
everyone needs to filter through. And no matter how good of a filter you have, it's hard to filter everything, you know?
It's super hard. And the process of growing, the process of accepting and listening to opinions that are not your own it's a difficult one because it brings out every single part of you that you might have, every fear you have, every insecurity you have, it's going to surface. So it's not, we can't expect perfection out of people, and it's just not going to happen. But I hope that we get to a place of just greater understanding and empathy amongst all of our
Mhm.
peers, because yeah.
And it would be great, you know, if we had some sort of fix or some sort of policy fix in our system, right? In terms of making sure voters are educated on objectively on issues. Where does Biden stand here? Where does Trump stand here? And not hear it from these political ads and the slanted viewpoints of each party, because what they're doing is manipulating people, right?
Yeah.
Like, and people are busy. They're trying to survive, live their own lives. But if there was just a simple way of educating voters, every registered voter had to watch a 10-15 minute video before they voted on the process, what issues matter, what they mean. I think that could be a step that I think could be helpful, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can't just have people voting on policies that potentially could change the fabric of our society from a completely ignorant standpoint, just like this is what I feel, so I'm going to vote, you know, and that's just one of my pet peeves about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you're totally spot on. I mean, along those lines, you go to the coronavirus, which played a factor in how we all voted, like we mentioned earlier. And you see both parties who, yeah, I would say probably the Democrats were more adamant about shutdowns and, living in LA, like we had been shut down for a long time. But for some reason, voting's not a problem when you vote for their party. It's like,
Yeah.
hey, come out and vote. Okay, but can I not go out to dinner? You know? Can
Yeah.
I not, like, go to the library?
Yeah, and you know what else is surprising is that the coronavirus itself, with how much time is spent on talking about it, I read that it's not even really an issue that's at the forefront of voters' minds. That's
It's
not what
it's not even an issue statistically that has any real impact. More people die every year from cigarette smoking than have died this year from coronavirus.
Yeah.
S
Yeah.
it's just interesting to see how much we blow up certain headlines to try and drive emotion,
Yeah.
which we're hoping will drive action. But in fact, our news media, the way we communicate information, all of it is really a method to drive you to vote for a certain party. And ultimately, it's something I'm not the biggest fan of. I'll just say that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it is what it is. You know, and we have to I think there's a lot of complaining that happens about our system, but I think we all kind of have to figure out a way to survive and thrive in it. That's the goal, right?
Yeah.
Like to make sure we're successful in the system and society that we live in. And to do so, you need to really understand how the game is played. And most of us, I'd say 95% of us don't even understand all of how our political system works, how our economy works, and so it's they want to be told what to think.
Yeah.
And that creates unique challenges, and I
Yeah.
think in this election, there are so many surprises. I think you brought up a fact before we jumped on that the black vote is actually split between Trump and Biden. We thought that Biden was going to win that vote and the minority vote in a landslide, and he isn't, you
The
know?
Hispanic vote in Florida was a very interesting one. The Cuban vote played a significant role in Trump winning that state,
Yeah, it did. It
which
did.
was projected to go blue. But, you know, Cubans, I forgot what policy it was specifically, um, but Cubans tended to identify more with Trump's policies than Biden's.
Well, I think Trump, again, goes back to what we said. He really successfully triggered that population with the far left socialist agenda.
That's what it
Like
was. That's what it
it's
was. Yeah.
it's such a trigger for those Cubans specifically because
Yeah.
of the system of government that exists. Just saying that, and as many times as he said it, they probably were like, "No socialism for us."
Yeah. It's
And
interesting too with immigrants that come in, right? Because
yeah,
a lot of them share that perspective where it's they come here and they're like, "Hey, can you please get off our backs?" You
yeah,
know?
yep,
And I this election's interesting because I do feel that it's a referendum on big government versus small government. Basically, can you get out of my life is what like I would say the sentiment of the Republican vote is like just let me live my life, stop getting in the way. And I think COVID plays a big factor in that. And I
yeah.
think on the Democratic side, it's more the argument of hey, the government is not fulfilling its responsibility to take care of its people. And I think that that's the nuance here.
Yeah, and I think, one of the larger issues I think is the government's inefficiency in terms of how it uses the revenue it's generated. I think the US generates more tax revenue than any nation in the world, I think. Don't quote me on that. I think I read that. It's been a while. But yet we're in the type of debt as a nation that we're in. So when you're making investment decisions, if I'm picking a stock and I look at a company's debt load and their debt is just significantly larger than their revenue, I'm going to be like, is this a good company to invest in? And right now, I feel like the United States government is not a good company to invest in because
Yeah.
they don't know how to operate efficiently. We should have a much better healthcare system. We should have better infrastructure. It's been neglected for decades. And it seems like our politicians, the moment one gets elected, the only thing they really, really care about is what's going to happen in the next election.
Yeah.
And they're building their entire agenda on how do we get this person out of office versus, hey, okay, this is the president. How are we going to work together and move the country forward? That's been lost in probably the last 20 or so years,
Yeah.
that, and I don't know when that bill is going to come due for us or if it's going to come due, if we're just going to keep being able to add debt because everybody needs our country's consumption and it doesn't really matter all that much. But it is a question because it's like, what are you guys doing with our money? I don't mind paying higher taxes if I see better infrastructure around me, better airports, better everything around me. I don't think people will be as upset at the government for taking our money. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and you know what? I mean, I think that's the clip, you know? I think that's exactly what people have concerns about, and, it can be easy to say, "I don't like this candidate, I'm gonna vote for this one." Either way, I've heard it both ways in this election, but if you're just voting because you dislike a candidate, you don't know what you're voting for. You
Yep.
might be voting for something worse than you meant to vote for. And
Yep.
so it's imperative that you understand those kinds of details. And it's the reality of it is that those things are very, very difficult to know as a regular person. And they're intentionally difficult
Yeah.
because I mean, Congress doesn't want everybody to know how things work. You don't want the sausage to be made. I heard
Yeah.
this quote in The West Wing. There's two things you don't want to know: how laws get made and how sausages get made.
That is the truth. That is the
Yeah,
truth. And I think, and also it's like this is now where are our priorities, right? Like Trump came out yesterday at 2 a.m. and said, "We've won this election and the votes need to stop being counted." Like our politics is becoming reality TV. And then
yeah,
Biden on the other side of this, my biggest pet peeve with Biden is I don't know where he really stands. He's basically running a campaign on I'm not Trump. But I don't fully know where he stands. It's like seems like he's just running a campaign to appease everyone that's disgruntled. And this has happened in the past. Is like a candidate runs on that, then gets into office and doesn't address any of the things or solves that he claims he was going to solve. And that's why we need to have clarity on where people stand.
yeah,
What are the issues? I think this, we're all about efficiency here. You have the ability to create a system in which you can poll every vote registered voter on what the issues are that matter to them, then break that down into percentages, and then have debates and conversations built specifically around that and that only versus just random manipulation and babble. And that's I don't I can stand on my soapbox. I complain more about how it's structured and how inefficient it is because at the end of the day, I know I'm going to have to survive if it's a Republican in office. I know I'm going to have to survive if a Democrat and thrive if a Democrat's in office. So, we just have to try to increase and improve our government before it crumbles. Do you have long-term concerns about whether or not this is sustainable? The way that we're operating now is sustainable?
no, I know it's not. I
Yeah.
I just understand that we're going to come to a point where some country is going to have to be forgiven of its debt, and it likely won't be us because we have the most military. So we can borrow probably a lot longer than most, but my anticipation is that it's in the smaller countries that have less solid military and financial systems and credit really due to the strength of their country and its ability to last for a long time. Um, my concern falls more into what's going to happen elsewhere in the world because you know I think the US is a lot like Tesla. Like we can
Yeah.
lose money forever and people are going to still increase the value of it.
Yes.
Um, that's just kind of the situation we're in. When I say forever, I'm just looking at kind of 100-year window.
Yeah.
But I do feel that the destabilization that's happening elsewhere in the world will cause financial issues that will come affect us. So I think if I were running the country, I would prioritize getting to a budget surplus quickly and the efficiency with which tax dollars are utilized, as opposed to focusing on policy specifically. I'd probably just focus on making the machine better.
Yeah.
Um, but that I understand why that's not the intent of most people who come into office. They have to actually run for president is a very, very exhaustive endeavor. So you have to
Yeah.
have a pretty darn good reason that you want to be president.
Yeah, you do. You do. And it's, honestly, that fear and concern of war is actually what was a huge deciding factor on my vote, you know.
Mhm.
And that's something we have to look at. It's like America lives in this bubble where we just really are only have to be concerned about what's happening here. And the truth is that we're a system that is very, very, very global. We're dependent on everyone. So it is important, like you said, even having that understanding of how smaller economies versus larger economies work, how that impacts our economy. Like those are things that, you have to actually seek the knowledge to understand. And those are the things that will help you become an informed voter. And being an informed voter is the best thing that you can do. Like you mentioned and stood on your soapbox on our last episode, be informed. There's no excuse. There's
Yeah.
no
Well,
excuse.
on top of that, when you're informed, you can also make a lot more money.
Yeah.
That's kind of the trick to the world is when you understand how the systems work, it becomes a lot easier to understand how to build a company or how to generate revenue for yourself.
Yep.
So that's another caveat when you stick to what you're told in terms of, get it, do this and then you'll get a job or do this or do that. It's only through the lens of the person who's giving you that information. But if you take the time to really build a deep understanding of how our government and how the world governments work, which by the way, everybody's taught this growing up. So it's really a function of, and if you didn't pay attention, don't worry, I didn't pay attention to history in high school. I thought it was really boring. But
Yeah.
now that I'm alive as an adult and I actually am seeing the impact of all of these decisions happen in real life, it's all of a sudden extremely exciting because it got humanized. And so, you know, if you can find that way to get engaged into how things work, whether it's in politics, policy making, or even how that interacts with business communities and how businesses in general work, um, and how they interact with our country and other countries, that can be a really, really profitable endeavor, and it'll make you an informed voter. Now I'm all
Yep.
about doing two things at once.
Yeah. And when you live in, people want to sometimes say, well, it's not all about the money. But when you live in a capitalist system, by definition, it is all about the money. Who has it versus who doesn't. Now, if you don't care about having power, then yes, it doesn't matter. But if you care about improving your situation and figuring out a way to improve your family's situation in a country like America, yeah, you do need to figure out how to make a few more bucks. You don't.
Yeah.
And that's just the cold hard truth.
Yeah. And honestly, I think money and like its effect on capitalism is really fascinating because it has the ability to also act as a voice in some sort,
Yes.
whether it's through advertising, whether it's through being able to organize people to execute something. Um, that it's a tool more than anything in
Mhm.
this society to be able to create change and to move things forward. And so one of the things we also struggle with is that culturally, due to again the human element that has played into the systems that we have, uh, people have taken advantage of other people to
Mhm.
create money for themselves due to an education or an information gap in terms of how the systems people understood. And that's kind of been a pervading theme throughout history. But I do think we're at the point with internet and with the access we all have to information, even on TikTok. I mean, I get educated on things just swiping through that feed.
Yeah.
And you know, that rapid, I would say, like adult education that's happening through non-regulated means is the future of how people treat and interact with a capitalist society and a government that's structured in that society. So I think that the next 30 years or so, with Gen Z shifting into voting and starting to have a voice, and by the way, Gen Z is the same generation, or, Gen Z and part of millennial, same generation that's brought flat Earth to us, same generation that's brought the moon landing conspiracy or like brought it to
Yeah.
prevalence. This is a generation that likes to question things because they've seen how easy it is to spin and manipulate information.
Yeah.
So it's going to be fascinating to see what happens in the next 30 years because as this generation starts to really understand the rules of our society, and I think they have a greater propensity to just because of the society they were born into, I think we'll see some massive disruption in terms of how political campaigns and news and media are run and how they can sustain because that generation, they don't watch the news. They don't
No, they don't.
care.
Yeah. They really don't. They really don't. I mean, they live in a different world, and you see it too, right? Like even in this voting process, it's like they don't participate.
Yeah.
Younger voters do not participate. And it was fascinating to me specifically with Bernie Sanders because they were saying, "Oh, well, the young voters love him," but they didn't turn out and vote for him, and that's like, where do we head when these people actually, I mean, these older voters actually do leave our society? What
Yeah.
is going to happen to our system? And then you bring up a great point. And one last bit on the economic and capitalist part of this is understanding how things actually get done with these politicians, that their positions in a lot of time, most part, are driven by who the lobbyist that's supporting them the most is, right?
Yeah.
Like, and understanding that process, like one you brought up earlier, the LGBTQ population voter base, they fought a fight to get to the point to get the rights that they have.
Yep.
But a big part of the reason that they were able to is they understood, they figured out the political system
Yep.
and the political side of this thing and operated within that to advance their cause, right?
Yep.
And that's one last point on that I think if you do have big goals or you want to impact change, just really understand that the political system is in the political sphere is the way that you're going to be able to make those big changes. You have to figure out how to influence the people to do what you want them to do.
Yeah. Absolutely, man. So just wrap up on the election. We have no idea what's going to happen. It's looking like it's leaning Biden, but it's still very, very close. So we'll have to see how these mail-in ballots pan
Mhm,
out. Also wanted to quickly mention um, Quibi shut down, and there's been a lot of press on them.
mhm.
They gave back it was about $350 million that they had in cash that they're going to give back to the investors. They're winding down everything. A lot of employees getting let go. And in general, the sentiment that I've read is that most employees absolutely loved working there. They really looked up to the leadership. I read a little bit about, some light growing pains of when Meg and Jeff started working together for the first time, some email threads that had come out. But in general, it seemed like a pretty well run operation from what I've read about it. It just seemed like a hypothesis that is reasonable from the standpoint of venture capital, from the standpoint of major production firms, and from the standpoint of those two founders, and a thesis that and business plan that, again, are reasonable, but just didn't work out.
Yeah, I think that some of the things that they assumed were incorrect, right? Not understanding and looking at from a competitive standpoint and marketing competition standpoint, they didn't feel like TV, Netflix, Hulu were their competition. They also didn't feel like Instagram, TikTok, and the social spheres were their competition because, Quibi was like, we're going to capture that content that people can capture on their phones in between times.
Yep.
But they didn't properly appreciate that even though that was their platform, they still have to compete with all these other YouTube exists,
Yeah. Yeah.
and understanding that you have to carve a niche. And I think they were hurt by their leadership a little, even though obviously Meg Whitman and Jeffrey Katzenberg are legends, right? As leaders, that lack of connectivity to where the market is today and how content is being driven today. Like I saw that they paid a whole bunch of like older talent, right, to come on their platform
Hmm.
versus going organic and also catering to some of these personalities that are they're famous on YouTube, that are
Yep.
famous on TikTok, and creating content around them that is going to engage the audience of people you're and consumer you're trying to reach.
Right.
That was definitely a major flaw. And then the final thing is I can't think of a show that you have to go to Quibi to watch, right? Like Netflix became famous because they had a series of shows that became really popular and people were telling other people they have to watch and people signed up. Like I know there are subscriptions that I have specifically. I'll subscribe specifically when I know a certain season of a show is coming on, you know?
Yeah.
So those there, it just goes to show that just because you have a bunch of money and you have all the tools to succeed, if your game plan doesn't take into account your competition properly, and evaluate your position in the marketplace and attack that aggressively. The writing was on the wall that this was probably not going to work out.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think there's a couple things that missed. I remember going through it, and content-wise, I just didn't find the content very
Was not
engaging.
yet.
Um, LeBron did a show on there, and it was just a documentary about his school that he funded, which, I mean, good for him, but I don't wanna watch that. Like,
Yeah,
I'm just not interested. And, I look at, like, how Apple TV's done it with their
yeah,
original base of content, and the quality is just significantly higher in terms of how engaging it is, the quality of the shows, the thoughtfulness, the creativity. They're funny, they're engaging. Even the Greatness Code series on Apple TV,
yeah,
excellent. And every episode, by the way, 9 minutes. It should have been on Quibi,
yeah,
right? But
yeah,
it's like those pieces. I think the thesis was right. I think their market also could have been incorrect, because I think that Gen Z has a lot of what they need through
yeah.
TikTok,
It's the
Snapchat, and all those other platforms. But I think that Gen X and millennials are more in need of what Quibi services would have provided, but probably more from a news standpoint, where you
yeah.
can get a 10-minute video update of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, it was just too big, too fast, and didn't properly evaluate the market
Yeah.
conditions or the consumer conditions that they were getting into. But I do think, you brought up a very good point earlier on is that, for every if you don't take the risk of a Quibi, because we can go through history and find many, many other things that have failed like Quibi has failed, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the media around it was like laughing or saying, "Look at this big failure. It's such a disappointment." And that creates a trigger. But I think there's a lot more to be gained from evaluating both the strengths and weaknesses of the platform,
Yeah.
and seeing how you can get better. One question I had for you on it was, do you think we're getting to a point where there's just too many different streaming platforms? Because I can't even keep track anymore. There are shows I watch on Amazon Prime, there are shows I watch on Netflix, there are shows I watch on Apple TV. Now HBO Go, like the individual networks are creating their own things. Do you think that we're getting to a point that there's this big new thing that helped Netflix explode as a company that now we're just too concentrated and too diluted? Or do you think there's really a space for as many platforms as people want to come up with?
So when they initially built the railroads, or even the roads, there are only
Mhm.
a few major brands of cars.
Yeah.
Now there's tons,
Mhm.
tons, new ones coming out every year. Why is that? The infrastructure is what takes time to build. With the internet, with media, even with media sharing, there was an IP advantage in being able to stream content. Now
Yeah.
that IP advantage is gone, it's not hard to build these systems, it's not hard to code them, and there's plenty of people who have that talent. So
Mhm.
there's no more infrastructure building that needs to happen, which opens up a market to a tremendous amount of competition. And typically what happens as the market saturates is you start to find these tribes that people form into. So like Prime has certain types of original content. Netflix has a certain style of
Yeah.
original content. Apple TV, a certain style of original content. Same with Disney. Each one has excellent shows and each one has terrible shows. And it's really the same thing we saw with TV channels. This is just how markets saturate, is that they turn into
Yeah.
areas with a lot of competition, and each one holds their own um, unique customer base and community. So I don't think anything that we're seeing is not normal from the standpoint of market saturation, but I think that in general, the understanding of the general consumer as to how markets progress, and really like uh, I like to tie everything back to some sort of reason to know the information, because you know nobody really cares how markets change. But this
Yeah.
is, if you're buying stocks, this is a really, really good piece of information to know, that whenever a new technology enters the market, infrastructure is the first thing that needs to get built. So it's great
Yeah.
to invest in infrastructure companies. Once the infrastructure is built, they're not going to grow as fast anymore, but they'll have tremendous amounts of value. That's great. And when you have that value, you can then start to invest in the players. It's the same thing we're seeing in esports, where people are investing in companies that do the finance side of esports, that do the infrastructure
Mhm.
side. And same thing in cannabis. People are investing in companies that help companies stay regulated and make sure that they're compliant, as opposed to investing in specific brands. And that's really the best way to think about how industries progress. So Quibi was, to your point, V, whenever you throw a lot of money at something and you don't build it organically, it's very, very hard to sustain.
Yep.
So that's one part of it, is that pace can be very, very negative when it
Mhm.
comes to building and growing a company. At the same time, looking at the way that Meg and Jeff went into this, raising a couple $1 billion and throwing it into this aggressive of a content strategy, they were looking for either a grand slam or nothing. And
Yeah, that's true.
that's all this money was raised pre-COVID, by the way.
Yeah,
So once COVID hit, the market actually leaned their way,
yeah,
which would have indicated that this was a brilliant idea. But sometimes these ideas don't work, and you, as a regular person, I think what's challenging is seeing that much money, especially when the majority of this country is struggling paycheck to paycheck, to see that much money just get blown in
yeah.
2 seconds.
That's it. Just goes to show you.
Yeah, that's hard. But, I think at the same time, it was a good swing. That's just what happens. And buyer beware, right? Like, everybody who put the money in knew the risks that they were getting into, but it was worth it for a proportionately or a disproportionately large return that they were hoping on. And they're going to make 10 of those bets, 100 of those bets over the next couple years. And, you know, some will hit.
One other question before we kind of move on here is where do you see the future of the traditional broadcast media, cable networks that have been long standing? Now with all these new platforms coming on, you pretty much can consume what you want versus buying a whole bunch of channels and content that you really don't need. Do you think that doomsday is coming soon for cable network operators and large networks?
I think it's just shifting. So if I'm cable network or news really channel operators, I'm buying all of the major Instagram pages that share my news or
Mhm.
share, if I'm ESPN, I'm buying the companies like Wave TV, which a friend of mine, Brian, runs, which is basically a bunch of Instagram pages that share relevant content for different sports. And they're very good at sharing news. They're very up to date, very similar to what Bleacher Report and Overtime are doing on social media. It's incredibly important to own those platforms because that's how the new generation perceives information. But that's just a part of running a news organization and understanding how technology changes. Your initial goal is the same, right? Getting information out to as many people as possible. But as demographics age, as the way news and information is transmitted changes, it's your responsibility to stay on top of that. And so I think we'll see who's smart. We'll see who's agile. We'll see who's smart. We'll see who's built innovative infrastructures and cultures and who has great leadership. And we'll see who doesn't as well.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
One last quick note: we wanted to give a RIP to Sean Connery.
One of the
Kind of
greatest.
one of the greatest in definition, I think, for a lot of men of what we aim to be as men, right? So,
Yeah.
and just also how he fought for people. Like reading the stories about him, he just seems like a genuine person in a very very disingenuous world. So
Yeah. Seriously. Well, awesome, man. This was great. Thanks, everybody, for listening. This is the Pilot Boys, and this is the wrap of our news and notes. Today, there is no interview segment because this is our election edition. So, without further ado,
oh, always remember, be you. You is flat. Oh, I'll edit this part out.
okay.
What was I supposed to say?
Yeah, the outro.
The outro. Okay. So I'll remember it starts at 49:60. That's all we have for today's show. If I'll just record it later. I'll record
Cool.
it later. Yeah. Because I can't think of it right now.
All right, man.
That was that was good.
I think that was a good episode.
I mean, I think we should just I almost feel like the election thing we should download and upload immediately so that we can
Yeah.
get some
Yeah.
some views today. And I think also we hit something today that I think is we can continue to do. Just pick little topics. Like one I was thinking about is how Bleacher Report capitalized on ESPN's inability to move quickly and other platforms, right? Like
Yeah.
how ESPN is struggling now. Like to just have those type of quick almost case studies live on
Yeah.
air, I think would be good. I know I did one very early on about the Popeye's chicken sandwich
Oh
took
yeah.
off that did really well.
That's
But
awesome.
but I think those are other things that
I
we can
totally agree, by the way. I'm the reason I'm unpacking. I have to hop on another call right now, bro.
all right, that's good. We got it done. So I'm gonna send it over to John and hopefully we'll have our episode edited here soon.
Perfect. All
All
right.
right, man. Take
Later.
care.